So, if you were to sit down in a couples therapist's office right now,
Okay.
and you just confidently announce that you and your partner, never fight, like ever,
Right.
the therapist isn't going to congratulate you. I mean, they aren't going to hand you an award for like achieving relationship nirvana.
No, statistically speaking, they're probably going to assume your relationship is clinically dead.
Exactly. Because we have this really pervasive, almost militant cultural narrative, right? That true love is supposed to be this frictionless, just completely gentle harbor.
Yeah, that's the story we're told.
And we're also told that having a family is this guaranteed formula for lifelong fulfillment. Or that if you just sit quietly on a cushion and observe your breath, your biological stress will just evaporate.
Which is a beautiful idea.
It is. But when you strip away the marketing and, the pop psychology and all those Instagram infographics, the raw behavioral data tells a story that is vastly darker.
Considerably darker.
Yeah, and vastly more complicated. And honestly, it's just completely upside down.
It really is. It forces this total reevaluation of the baseline human condition. Because we are heavily conditioned to view human psychology through this teleological lens.
Right.
Like, we want to believe our behaviors are constantly moving us toward this state of pure happiness or zen.
But that's not what the numbers say.
Not at all. The data we are examining today suggests that our most profound emotional investments are inextricably linked to our most intense conflicts and our distress, too.
So welcome to the deep dive. We are exploring a stack of highly provocative source material today, and it's all anchored by this extensive breakdown from a channel called Nothingness, Antidote to Narcissism.
Yeah, fascinating source.
Really fascinating. The specific transcript is titled 4 Facts to Blow Your Mind, and the framing here is essentially like a whistleblower action against modern psychology.
Which is a bold stance.
Totally. The creator argues that the psychiatric establishment, academic researchers, our broader culture, they've essentially constructed a Disneyland fantasy of human behavior.
And, the primary function of that Disneyland fantasy is basically to protect us from the highly uncomfortable reality of how human beings actually operate when the pressure is on.
Right, it's a shield. So our mission today is to take these 4 deeply counterintuitive data points from this source, and we need to analyze the methodologies behind these academic studies.
Have you decode the statistics?
Exactly, and figure out the underlying mechanisms. But I want to be clear, we aren't here to moralize. We are just here to impartially report on this content and look at the structural logic of these human paradoxes. We aren't taking any sides.
Right. We're just looking at the raw data.
So I want you, yes, you listening right now, to completely suspend your assumptions about what makes up a quote-unquote healthy human experience. Let's just start with the most explosive claim in the research.
This one is going to challenge a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. It completely redefines the nature of relationship conflict. Because to understand baseline happiness, we have to look at how we treat our primary emotional investments, right?
Right. So the source material draws on this 2021 textbook, Human Sexuality, Biological, Psychological, and Cultural Perspectives.
Okay.
It's a really comprehensive text, and it specifically highlights a 2003 study by a researcher named Hammock.
And what were they looking for exactly?
Well, this study set out to identify the predictive variables for aggressive behavior within intimate partnerships. And it is crucial, like really crucial, that we define the parameters of aggression the same way the study did.
Yeah, because they weren't just measuring simple bickering over household chores or whatever.
No, not at all. The methodology separated the aggression into 2 very severe categories.
Break this down for us.
First, physical aggression. So the study defined this as actions intending to deliver or actually delivering physical harm.
Like what?
The metrics included hitting, kicking, choking, and forcing sex. So we're talking about highly volatile, criminal behaviors.
Wow. Okay, so extremely serious stuff. And the second category?
Then they measured psychological aggression. And this was defined as tactics specifically deployed to harm the self-concept of the recipient.
Meaning like emotional abuse.
Exactly. Isolating a partner from their friends and family, sustained humiliation, degradation, and just intense retaliatory emotional abuse.
Okay, so the researchers were looking for independent variables, right? Like what psychological states reliably predict that a person will use these specific, highly destructive behaviors against their partner.
Right. And, the prevailing cultural assumption, that Disneyland narrative we talked about, is that abuse occurs in a vacuum of affection.
Like, we assume a partner becomes abusive because they just lack empathy.
Yeah, that they lack emotional connection and ultimately that they lack love for the victim.
Which, I mean, that makes logical sense on the surface. But that brings us to the finding that I literally had to read 3 times in our notes just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it.
It is a shocking finding.
The variables that most strongly and reliably predicted the use of both severe physical and psychological aggression were high levels of love, high levels of trust, and massive emotional commitment.
Let that sink in. The data presents a direct positive correlation.
That is wild.
Individuals who self-reported the highest levels of love and emotional commitment for their partners were statistically the most likely to utilize physical and psychological aggression.
Okay, wait. We really need to unpack the mechanics of this, because on its face, it sounds like we are saying a healthy relationship is a violent one.
Right. Or that love is inherently abusive.
Yeah. Explain this to me like I'm 5. Are we saying a healthy relationship is abusive?
No, not at all. That is not what the data is indicating. What it's doing is identifying the motive.
The motive, okay.
Yes. It is exposing the underlying structural logic of human emotional investment. The researchers theorize that people simply do not expend the immense physiological and psychological energy required to execute these behaviors on subjects they do not care about.
Oh, I get it. Like, if an acquaintance or a coworker insults you, you might experience a spike of irritation, right? But you don't dedicate the next 6 months of your life to systematically isolating them from their family. The cognitive load just isn't worth it.
Exactly. There's no return on investment. An uncommitted relationship has very low stakes.
Right.
But when you introduce extreme levels of emotional commitment, well, the stakes become existential. You now have an asset of immense subjective value.
And that creates a terrifying vulnerability, does it?
Precisely. That extreme high investment generates a powerful evolutionary and psychological motive for control. You have to secure the investment. You have to ensure the partner cannot abandon you.
So it's like a tangled ball of yarn. We assume the red string, which is love, and the black string, which is anger, are totally separate things. But this study says they are actually the exact same string, just pulled way too tight.
That is a perfect analogy. The aggression is essentially a mutated, highly toxic form of mate guarding. And furthermore, when a highly valued partner commits a perceived slight, a betrayal, an insult, even just a shift in attention, the emotional pain inflicted is catastrophic.
Because of that high trust and high love.
Exactly. And that catastrophic pain triggers a massive, overwhelming motive for retaliation.
This completely upends how we traditionally view the cognitive dissonance of domestic abuse victims. The source material points out that for decades, victims of intimate partner violence have explained their abuse with phrases like, he only acts like this because he loves me.
Or she checks my phone and isolates me because she's so intensely committed and jealous.
Right. And the standard psychiatric response has been to treat those statements as tragic defense mechanisms. Like, we tell the victim, no, they don't love you, they just want to hurt you.
We assume love and control are entirely separate psychological mechanisms.
But this data suggests that from the abuser's internal psychological reality, the victim's assessment of the motive is often entirely accurate.
Yes, shockingly so. The abuser's horrific behavior is inextricably tangled with their possessive commitment.
So it's not that the love negates the abuse. It's that the intense, completely unregulated emotional investment is the literal fuel source for the paranoia and the retaliation.
Exactly. The higher the subjective value of the partner, the higher the terror of loss. And the more likely that terror is to metastasize into controlling behaviors.
Which brings us back to that stark metaphor from the source, that a relationship without conflict is a corpse.
Right. Because if the fighting completely stops, it means the emotional stakes have dropped to zero. If you no longer care enough to argue, you no longer value the investment enough to guard it.
But man, this presents an incredibly difficult question for anyone listening right now. If conflict and jealousy and anger are actually barometers of emotional life force, and extreme emotional investment predicts psychological abuse, how do we draw the line?
How do we define a boundary?
Yeah. How do you, listening to this, draw the line between a legitimate debate and toxic control?
That is the crux of the issue. And the source material stresses that boundaries are not universally objective. They are highly subjective and culturally mediated.
What one couple defines as a legitimate debate to reach consensus, another might define as toxic verbal assault.
Right. If a partner demands to know exactly where you are at 11 p.m. on a Friday, One person views that as suffocating, isolating control.
And another person views that as a deeply comforting sign that their partner cares about their safety.
And both interpretations are psychologically valid within their respective contexts.
So the takeaway here isn't to normalize abuse. We want to be very clear about that.
Absolutely not. The takeaway is to abandon the simplistic binary that emotional intensity is uniformly positive. Love is a volatile, heavy investment.
Right. Recognizing that our darkest, most possessive behaviors stem from the exact same neurobiological systems as our brightest behaviors. That allows us to actually manage those dynamics.
Rather than just acting shocked when they inevitably collide.
Okay, so we're establishing that emotional investment is essentially the engine of conflict in romantic relationships. But romantic love is just one vector of human attachment.
Right.
If we really want to test this theory of investment versus baseline happiness, we have to look at the most extreme form of biological, financial, and emotional investment possible.
The ultimate emotional investment.
Yes, the one we are culturally mandated to view as the ultimate source of pure joy. Let's look at reproduction in children. Does creating a family actually lead to happiness?
This is where the paradigm shift becomes incredibly uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because if deep emotional investment inherently brings sustained cognitive load, conflict, and stress, the inevitable question is, does it actually yield a statistical increase in happiness?
Because the cultural script we are handed from birth is unambiguous. Having children provides ultimate purpose. It is the defining achievement of a successful adult life.
But the source material completely dismantles this, and it starts with a major multinational study led by researcher Jennifer Glass.
Okay, let's get into the Glass study. What did they do?
So it's titled Parenthood and Happiness: Effects of Work-Family Reconciliation Policies in 22 OECD Countries. They looked at data across heavily industrialized nations to measure the baseline happiness of parents versus non-parents.
And to see how differing government policies impact that gap, right?
Exactly. And the expert in our source video zeroes in on the academic framing of this study. They actually accused the researchers of executing a massive sleight of hand in how they presented their own findings.
Oh, this part was fascinating. It's a classic example of academic literature trying to soften a socially taboo conclusion.
That is exactly what it is. In the abstract and the conclusion of the paper, the authors heavily emphasize that generous family policies, things like expansive paid time off, mandatory sick leave, heavily state-subsidized childcare, that these things are associated with smaller disparities in happiness between those who have children and those who do not.
Wait. So they just bury the lid to secure the funding and the favorable press?
Pretty much. They focus on the government policy making the gap smaller, which intentionally distracts from the massive radioactive core finding of the research itself.
Which is that the gap intrinsically exists in the first place.
Precisely. If you look past the framing and examine the raw data across these 22 countries, the undeniable reality is that childless individuals report considerably higher levels of subjective well-being and happiness than parents.
Across their entire lifespan. So baseline happiness drops when you have kids.
Yes. And the data shows that no amount of state-sponsored childcare or generous paid leave actually reverses that polarity. It merely mitigates the severity of the drop.
That is heavy. But to really understand the timeline of this happiness deficit, we can't just look at a snapshot. We have to look over time. And the source introduces this monumental longitudinal study by Nicholas Wolfinger.
Yes, Wolfinger's research is vital here because of the sheer scale of it. He analyzed 4 decades of data from the General Social Survey.
Which is what, like the most respected sociological survey in the U.S.?
Arguably, yes. It's been running consistently since 1972. And he isolated a sample of nearly 14,000 adults, specifically in the 50 to 70 age cohort.
Okay, 50 to 70, which is the exact demographic window where children are usually finishing high school, going to college, or entering the workforce.
Right, which brings us to the great cultural myth of the empty nest syndrome.
Oh man, the empty nest syndrome. We hear about this constantly.
It's this clinical-sounding term we've all just accepted as biological fact. The narrative that when the children finally leave the home, the parents are plunged into this profound crisis of meaning. Deep depression, marital dissatisfaction, all due to the sudden void in their daily lives.
But Wolfinger's 40 years of empirical data reveals that this syndrome is virtually entirely fictional.
Completely fictional. The findings were brutally consistent across all cross-sections of the analysis. Older parents who still had minor or adult children residing in the home were significantly less happy than their exact chronological contemporaries whose children had already moved out.
And it wasn't some minor margin of error either, was it?
No. We are talking about a statistically significant 5 to 6% deficit in overall happiness for the parents who still had kids at home compared to the empty nesters.
5 to 6%. I mean, in the context of broad sociological well-being metrics, a 5 to 6% delta is massive.
It's huge. The emotional reality painted by 40 years of data is not one of grief or loss of purpose. When the children finally vacate the premises, the parents are statistically elated.
Daily.
Yes, they report sustained spikes in personal relief, marital satisfaction, and overall joy. The burden of constant logistical, financial, and emotional hypervigilance is suddenly lifted.
I mean, let's break this down so simple a child could understand it. Is this basically like carrying a super heavy backpack?
That's a great way to look at it.
Like people tell you carrying this backpack builds character, and the government might give you a better, more padded strap to make it hurt less, which is the subsidies.
Right.
But at the end of the day, taking the backpack off is what actually makes you happy.
Exactly. Think about the cognitive load required to raise a human being in the modern world. It is a relentlessly demanding executive function task that runs 24 hours a day for 2 decades.
Yeah, the idea that you would be depressed when that massive cognitive load is finally lifted just defies basic physiological logic. Like you said, you take off that 50-pound weight vest, your joints don't go into mourning, you feel lighter than air.
And yet, the empty nest syndrome narrative persists, which raises a really profound sociological question.
Which is?
If the data has shown for half a century that parents experience a surge of happiness when their children leave, why do we continue to culturally enforce the lie that they are heartbroken?
Why does society push this narrative?
I think we have to look at the evolutionary and economic imperatives of society itself. A society requires a constant influx of new labor and consumers to sustain its economic models.
Right, it needs workers. It needs localized stability.
Yes. So if the dominant cultural narrative was honest, if society openly advertised, hey, having children will drastically increase your stress, heavily reduce your baseline happiness, and you won't feel true relief until they leave your house in 20 years, well, the birth rate would likely plummet even faster than it currently is.
That makes total sense. We are subjected to systemic cultural conditioning. We are expected to project this highly curated, unadulterated joy regarding family life.
And when a parent's internal, private experience is instead characterized by exhaustion or resentment or just an overwhelming desire for the children to leave, that parent experiences intense cognitive dissonance.
And guilt. So much guilt.
Massive guilt. They believe they are broken because their biological reality doesn't match the Disneyland script.
Which perfectly sets up the third major segment of our deep dive. Because if the baseline state of our most highly valued, culturally mandated relationships are partners, our children is fundamentally characterized by acute stress and intense conflict.
And a statistical deficit in baseline happiness.
Right, then the human brain has to process that reality somehow. It creates tremendous psychological friction.
In modern society has developed a very specific, highly lucrative infrastructure for managing that exact friction.
Oh, absolutely. The modern playbook is absolute. If you are stressed by the immense burden of your relationships or your family, the solution is twofold. You manage the neurochemistry with medication, and you manage the mind with mindfulness.
But our sources suggest this cure might be worse than the disease.
Yeah, the source material makes a terrifying argument that our modern cures for normal human distress are fundamentally misdiagnosing the problem, and in many cases causing profound psychological damage.
We have to start with how we conceptualize stress itself. The source references a really compelling New Scientist article by Catherine DeLange.
And what does she say?
Well, her thesis challenges the modern orthodoxy that stress is this inherently toxic, destructive force that must be eradicated at all costs.
Right, because DeLange argues that our biological stress response, the cortisol spikes, the adrenaline, the heightened heart rate, that all survived the evolutionary filter for a very good reason.
It is an incredibly sophisticated mobilization system. When your body experiences stress, it is heightening your situational awareness and mobilizing glucose for immediate energy demands.
It's an adaptive state.
Yes. DeLange's research indicates that when individuals change their cognitive framing of stress, like when they stop panicking over the meta-experience of feeling panicked and instead view the physical arousal as their body preparing them to meet a challenge, they actually exhibit better cardiovascular profiles.
Really?
Yeah, better cardiovascular health, clearer executive functioning, and much higher resilience.
But the medical establishment doesn't encourage us to harness that adaptive state, do they?
No. They encourage us to pathologize it and suppress it.
Enter Dr. Alan Francis. He's a professor emeritus of psychiatry at Duke University and the author of Saving Normal.
His perspective is so critical here.
Extremely critical. Because he wasn't just a bystander. He was an instrumental architect of the diagnostic criteria used by psychiatrists worldwide. He was heavily involved in previous iterations of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Which means his indictment of the manual comes from the highest possible level of insider authority.
Exactly. And Dr. Francis argues that the psychiatric community made a catastrophic structural error, and it began in 1980 with the publication of the DSM-3 and was compounded in the DSM-5.
The fatal flaw was collapsing two completely distinct, ideologically different states of human suffering into a single massive umbrella diagnosis called major depressive disorder.
This is such a crucial distinction. We need to look really closely at these two types of depression that were merged. So what is the first type?
The first is historically known as melancholic or endogenous depression. This is a severe, systemic biological illness.
Like a true physiological crisis.
Yes. It manifests as a profound neurochemical breakdown. Patients experience severe psychomotor retardation, meaning they have immense difficulty physically moving or speaking. They lose the ability to eat or sleep.
Wow.
The emotional pain is completely unmoored from external circumstances. It's often described as an unbearable, agonizing weight, sometimes accompanied by delusions. It is a devastating inability to function that absolutely requires aggressive medical and pharmacological intervention.
Okay, so that is type 1. True, severe, endogenous melancholia. Now, what is the second type that the DSM lumped in with it?
The second is reactive depression. This is an entirely different mechanism. It exists on a continuum with normal, baseline, human sadness.
So it's a psychological reaction to the acute stresses of living.
Exactly. The grief of a divorce, the crushing weight of parenting, financial ruin, the loss of a job. It is situationally dependent.
But the DSM categorized them under the exact same diagnostic label. I mean, let's use a weather analogy to explain this so it's super simple. It's like diagnosing a passing rainstorm and a Category 5 hurricane as the exact same weather event and trying to give them the exact same treatment.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. It is a catastrophic failure of categorization.
And that is the precise danger Dr. Francis highlights, right? By conflating the two, the psychiatric establishment effectively medicalized the inevitable disappointments, griefs, and exhaustion that are simply baked into the human condition.
We began diagnosing normal situational sadness as a biological disease.
And the pharmaceutical industry weaponized this ambiguity with devastating efficiency. The source material outlines how pharmaceutical marketing campaigns capitalized on this broad, vague DSM criteria to sell the chemical imbalance theory to the general public.
They convince people that all distress, whether it's endogenous melancholy or just the exhaustion of raising a toddler, was a medical defect requiring a pill.
Which brings us to the statistics, which are just staggering. Currently, roughly 11% of the entire American population is prescribed an antidepressant.
And if you isolate the demographic of women over the age of 40, the prescription rate jumps to an astonishing 25%.
25%. 1 in 4 women in that cohort is medically managed for depression.
Dr. Francis refers to this phenomenon as the creation of an army of fake patients.
An army of fake patients. And he points out how it happens structurally in the clinic. Because primary care physicians, who have incredibly limited time, use these highly generalized self-reported screening questionnaires.
Questionnaires that are highly sensitive but incredibly nonspecific.
Right. They generate a massive volume of false positives.
Exactly. A patient comes in experiencing severe reactive distress because their life is objectively difficult. They check the boxes for poor sleep and low mood, and they are handed a prescription to alleviate the symptom, completely bypassing the situational cause.
And Francis highlights the dual tragedy here. Not only are we medicating millions of the worried well who are just experiencing normal life friction, but this massive overtreatment completely monopolizes finite medical and psychiatric resources. It distracts the medical system from the people suffering from true endogenous melancholia who are chronically undertreated.
So if the pharmacological approach to situational stress is deeply flawed, what do we do? Well, the modern cultural pivot has been toward alternative, non-medical interventions.
Right, and the primary prescribed alternative is mindfulness and meditation. It's presented as the ultimate side effect-free Buddha pill.
It's ancient, it's natural, it's purely internal. What could possibly go wrong with sitting in a quiet room and observing your breath?
Well, the source material brings in research by psychologists Miguel Farias and Claire Wilson that absolutely detonates the modern mindfulness industry.
It really does.
If anyone listening has ever tried to meditate, felt their heart start racing, and assumed they were just biologically failing at being Zen, you need to hear this data.
Yes, you do. Farais and his team conducted a highly rigorous, systematic review of the clinical evidence surrounding the psychological outcomes of meditation. And the data they uncovered is entirely absent from the marketing materials of popular meditation apps.
Tell us the number.
They found that approximately 1 in 12 individuals, roughly 8% of people who engage in meditation, experience an unwanted adverse psychological effect.
8%. I mean, think about that. If you launched an over-the-counter vitamin and 8% of the people who took it experienced severe adverse physiological reactions, the FDA would rip it off the shelves before the end of the week.
Without a doubt. And we aren't talking about getting a little bored or fidgety during meditation.
Right. What is the clinical spectrum of these negative effects?
The adverse reactions span a severe clinical spectrum. They range from paradoxically increased anxiety and exacerbated depressive symptoms to full-blown panic attacks, the spontaneous onset of panic disorders in previously asymptomatic individuals.
And in the extreme cases.
In the most extreme cases documented in the literature, episodes of psychosis and suicidal ideation.
Psychosis triggered by breathing exercises. I mean, the immediate skeptical response to this is to question the methodology. How did Farias arrive at this number? Is this just a cherry-picked fringe study designed to be contrarian?
Not at all. The methodology was a meticulous meta-analysis. They scanned the medical literature and isolated 55 relevant peer-reviewed studies.
Okay.
But the critical methodological step they took was implementing strict exclusion criteria for bias.
Oh.
Because the fundamental problem with mindfulness research is that the vast majority of it is conducted by researchers who are themselves dedicated proponents of meditation.
Oh, of course. So they approach the study with a heavy confirmation bias. They design the parameters to measure the efficacy of the positive outcomes, and they literally do not include a mechanism in the study to record or track adverse events.
Exactly. It's not science, it's a clinical marketing brochure.
Right. So Farias threw those out.
He did. His team threw out the biased studies and only aggregated data from neutral, rigorously structured trials that actively measured all outcomes. They adjusted for the sample size variations to ensure statistical integrity, and that is how they arrived at the 8% figure.
And the expert in the source material emphasizes that because of the pervasive underreporting in this field, 8% is almost certainly a vast underestimate, isn't it?
Yes. The true prevalence of adverse psychological reactions to meditation could realistically be as high as 1 in 5.
1 in 5.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to understand the mechanism here. Why does an ancient practice designed to induce tranquility trigger a panic attack?
The source utilizes the clinical perspective of psychologist Katie Sparks to explain the neurobiological and psychological mechanics of the backlash.
What does she say?
She points out that mindfulness inherently requires the practitioner to force their attention entirely inward, to hyper-monitor their internal somatic and cognitive states, and to forcibly attempt to still the natural, chaotic stream of consciousness.
Trying to still the thoughts.
Exactly. And Sparks notes that this forced suppression often causes the brain's networks to wildly rebel.
We really have to visualize what is actually happening in the brain here, because most of us get through the immense stress of our daily lives by relying heavily on psychological defense mechanisms, right? Compartmentalization, external distraction, repression.
Yes.
We take all of our trauma, our financial anxiety, our relationship conflicts, and we lock them in a dark, soundproof room in the back of our minds so we can function at work and raise our kids.
We have to, just to survive the day.
Yeah.
And mindfulness systematically dismantles those exact defense mechanisms.
Right. I want to use an analogy here to make it super clear. Imagine your brain is a messy closet you've been ignoring for years. Mindfulness is like turning on a blinding stadium spotlight in that closet and just being forced to stare at the mess without any tools to actually clean it up.
That is a perfect image. It's like being locked in a sensory deprivation tank. Without the external noise to distract you, your own internal anxieties become amplified to the point of auditory hallucinations.
You are forcibly stripping away the mind's protective barriers, but you aren't providing the practitioner with any clinical psychiatric tools to process that trauma. You are just forcing them to stare at it in silence.
Of course, the default mode network rebels.
Yeah.
Of course, the central nervous system interprets that as an acute threat and triggers a panic attack. It is a profound sensory and emotional overload.
No wonder people panic.
And the source material astutely points out a historical context that we completely ignore in the West. The original Hindu and Buddhist architects of these practices never designed them to be casual 10-minute stress relief hacks for corporate employees.
Right, they were extreme, rigorous spiritual technologies.
Designed to fundamentally deconstruct the practitioner's ego and sense of self.
And ego dissolution is not a relaxing spa treatment. It is a fundamentally terrifying, psychologically violent process that historically required the strict supervision of a master over decades.
And yet we package it as a smartphone app and tell vulnerable, highly stressed people that if they experience terror while doing it, they're simply doing it wrong.
It is absolute gaslighting. If you are listening to this and you attempt to forcefully silence your mind and your body responds with extreme anxiety, you are not broken.
No, your mind is operating exactly as it evolved to. It is aggressively defending its functional equilibrium against an unnatural, forced intervention.
Which brings us to a fascinating conceptual pivot, the final piece of our deep dive today.
Let's get into it.
If pharmacological interventions often misdiagnose normal situational distress, and internal mental control techniques like meditation can trigger severe psychological backlash, well, we are left examining the primary remaining mechanism we use to govern our behavior.
We are forced to look at our raw, internal self-control. Willpower.
Right. We assume willpower is a fixed biological trait. You are either born with the prefrontal cortex capacity to delay gratification or you aren't.
And the bedrock of that scientific assumption for the last 50 years has been the most famous psychological experiment of the 20th century.
The marshmallow test.
The marshmallow test. It is impossible to overstate how foundational this test is to modern developmental psychology. It heavily influenced educational policy, parenting strategies, our entire cultural understanding of success.
Let's detail the exact parameters of the original experiment so we can understand how completely it has been dismantled by this new source.
So in the early 1970s at Stanford University, psychologist Walter Mischel designed this deceptively simple test. A researcher brings a preschooler into a barren, distraction-free room. They place a single marshmallow or sometimes a pretzel or a cookie on the table.
Okay.
The researcher tells the child, you can eat this treat right now, or I'm going to leave the room for 15 minutes. If you wait and do not eat it until I return, I will give you 2 treats.
The ultimate test of patience.
The researcher leaves, and a hidden camera records the child's behavioral response.
And the findings, and more importantly, the longitudinal follow-up studies based on those findings, became absolute psychological dogma. Mischel's data suggested that the children who were able to delay gratification and wait the full 15 minutes for the second marshmallow demonstrated vastly superior life outcomes decades later.
The correlations were framed as absolute destiny.
They really were.
The waiters allegedly had significantly higher SAT scores, lower body mass indexes, lower rates of substance abuse, higher income brackets, and fewer behavioral problems.
So the scientific consensus calcify around a very specific interpretation, right? That the ability to delay gratification was an innate neurocognitive trait.
If a 4-year-old ate the marshmallow immediately, the assumption was that they possessed a fundamental biological deficit in impulse control. Their executive function was deemed inferior, and their life trajectory was assumed to be inherently compromised.
Which is insane when you think about it. We judged the biological capacity of a human brain based entirely on its reaction to a piece of candy.
We did.
And that dogma held completely firm until a truly groundbreaking study was published in 2022 in the journal Psychological Science. The research team was Yanaoka, Michelson, Munakata, and Saito. And they introduced a variable into the methodology that completely shattered the original premise.
They introduced cultural conditioning.
Yes. Let's talk about the origin of this 2022 study because it's a fascinating example of how scientific paradigms shift.
One of the lead researchers, Professor Yuko Munakata, operates in the United States but is of Japanese heritage. And during a sabbatical in Kyoto, Japan, she observed a striking behavioral contrast on the first day of school.
What did she see?
Her American children, operating on their normal cultural programming, immediately tore open their lunchboxes and began eating the moment they sat down.
As American kids do.
And the Japanese students were horrified. They actively stopped the American kids, explaining that Japanese cultural etiquette strictly mandates that absolutely no one eats a single bite of food until every person is seated and the meal is officially communally initiated.
So her American children had to endure the acute friction of learning to wait for food.
Exactly. But simultaneously, Professor Murukata observed the exact inverse behavioral pattern regarding gifts.
Oh, this is the best part.
Her American children were highly conditioned to delay gratification when it came to presents. American cultural norms dictate waiting for a specific event, Christmas morning, a birthday party, to unwrap a gift, regardless of when it is received.
But the Japanese cultural norm is completely inverted. Social convention in Japan dictates that when you are handed a wrapped gift, it is a sign of respect and gratitude to the giver to open it immediately, right in front of them, to show your appreciation.
This dual observation generated a profound hypothesis. Munakata realized that Japanese children exhibited intense, automatic delayed gratification regarding food, but almost zero delayed gratification regarding gifts.
And American children exhibited the exact opposite behavioral profile, which begs the monumental question, what if Walter Mischel's marshmallow test wasn't measuring innate biological willpower at all?
What if it was just measuring arbitrary, localized cultural habits?
So to test this empirically, the research team designed a brilliant cross-cultural methodology. Tell us how they set it up.
They recruited a cohort of 144 children, half from the cultural environment of Boulder, Colorado, and half from Kyoto, Japan. They subjected both groups to the classic marshmallow test, measuring their ability to delay gratification for food.
Right.
But then they introduced a second, separate test. They measured the exact same children's ability to wait to open a wrapped gift.
And the data from this dual testing completely validated the hypothesis. And in doing so, it humiliated 50 years of established psychological consensus.
It really did. The children in Kyoto, Japan dominated the food test. They waited a median time of 15 minutes. But when presented with the wrapped gift, they displayed almost zero impulse control, tearing it open in less than 5 minutes.
And the cohort from Boulder, Colorado performed the exact mirror image. They demonstrated immense executive function regarding the gift, waiting nearly 15 minutes before opening it. But when confronted with the marshmallow, their quote-unquote willpower completely evaporated. They lasted less than 4 minutes before eating it.
The performance was entirely domain-specific based on geography. We really need to talk about what the expert in the source video calls the locus of delayed gratification.
Let's do it. How does this data fundamentally shift our understanding of where self-control actually comes from?
Historically, psychology assumed the locus of control was internal. It was believed to reside in the neurobiology of the individual's prefrontal cortex. You either possessed the neurocircuitry for patience or you didn't.
Right.
But this 2022 study provides empirical proof that the locus of control is heavily external. It is neurologically mapped by the societal rules and daily habits the child is immersed in.
So the Japanese children didn't possess a superior willpower gene for food. They just had deeply ingrained daily habits enforced by relentless peer pressure and communal expectations.
Waiting to eat was automatic for them.
And the American kids weren't biologically deficient in self-control. Their culture just didn't assign any moral or social value to waiting for a snack, but it did assign immense social value to waiting to open a Christmas present.
It exposes a massive, pervasive methodological flaw in the behavioral sciences, particularly in weird psychology, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Because Walter Mischel, an American researcher, unconsciously projected his own localized cultural assumptions into the laboratory environment. He assumed that delaying gratification for a high-sugar food was a universal objective metric for superior human biology.
When in reality, he was essentially running a diagnostic test on local table manners.
It is the height of scientific arrogance. Let me break this down. It's like grading a fish on its ability to climb a tree. The American kids weren't lacking self-control any more than the Japanese kids were. They were just following different rules of politeness. We were looking at a 4-year-old American kid who just wanted a snack and diagnosing them with a lifelong executive function deficit.
And the source video highlights a very poignant detail regarding the behavioral coping mechanisms the children deployed during the test.
Oh yeah, the self-soothing techniques.
The hidden cameras recorded children engaging in elaborate self-soothing behaviors to endure the waiting period. They were pacing the room, aggressively counting the acoustic dots on the ceiling tiles.
Using their fingers to draw their names on the desk, just trying to survive the boredom.
Right. This indicates that the children who waited the longest weren't necessarily exhibiting raw, stoic willpower. They were often just the children who were highly attuned to authority and social compliance. They recognized the unspoken rules of the laboratory environment, and expended massive cognitive energy trying to be good, according to the parameters set by the adult researcher.
Now, the 2022 study doesn't conclude that the ability to delay gratification is irrelevant to future success. Obviously, being able to endure short-term friction for a long-term goal is a required skill for a functional life,
Sure.
but it completely changes our understanding of how that skill is acquired and deployed.
It shifts self-control from a fixed biological destiny to a malleable, culturally constructed habit.
Which leads to an incredibly empowering realization. If our ability to resist temptation isn't a fixed genetic trait, but rather a reflection of our environmental conditioning, does that mean we can hack our own willpower just by changing our environment?
Exactly. The researchers concluded that when an environment naturally enforces and supports a behavior, delaying gratification becomes automatic. You don't have to white-knuckle your way through resisting a temptation if your surrounding culture has already neurologically mapped the habit of waiting.
So, by modifying the external locus, your environment, your daily systems, your peer group, you fundamentally alter your internal brain systems, making success require drastically less conscious cognitive load.
Precisely.
I want you to apply this directly to your own life right now. Think about the specific marshmallows you constantly struggle to resist, the habits you constantly berate yourself for failing to break. Are those failures truly indicative of a biological lack of willpower, or are they the inevitable, mathematically predictable result of the dog-eat-dog instant gratification culture you live in?
Because if you exist in a hyper-capitalist culture that algorithmically optimizes for instant gratification, frictionless purchasing, and immediate dopamine loops, struggling to delay gratification is not a moral failing.
It is evidence that your cultural conditioning is functioning exactly as was designed to.
Exactly.
We have covered a truly massive amount of psychological terrain today. Let's briefly recap the journey of this deep dive. We began by completely unlearning the myths of relationship bliss. We looked at data proving that extreme emotional commitment and love are the exact variables that predict severe psychological and physical control. Conflict signals investment.
We then explored the reality of reproductive investment, examining decades of sociological data demonstrating that parenting severely reduces baseline happiness, and that the cultural narrative of the empty nest syndrome is a socially engineered fiction. We are happier when they leave.
From there, we examined how modern society attempts to medicate this baseline distress. We saw how the psychiatric establishment's failure to distinguish between biological melancholia and normal reactive sadness created an army of over-medicated patients.
And we exposed the dangers of overtreating normal stress with pills and risky meditation, analyzing rigorous metadata showing that forcefully dismantling the mind's protective barriers triggers severe psychological backlash.
And we concluded by stripping away the biological determinism of the marshmallow test, proving that the cultural bias hiding inside it means our internal willpower is largely just the automatic execution of localized habits. So why does understanding these raw, unpolished truths actually matter?
Because the Disneyland fantasy is fundamentally oppressive. When society constantly projects these impossible, frictionless narratives onto the incredibly complex, inherently messy data of human behavior, it generates massive psychological guilt.
The truth is liberating because it acts as an absolute solvent for that guilt.
When you realize that psychology often projects cultural fantasies onto complex data, you free yourself from the guilt of not feeling perfectly happy, perfectly relaxed, or perfectly disciplined. Understanding the raw mechanics allows you to navigate the actual territory of your life rather than constantly punishing yourself for failing to match the map of a fantasy world.
That is the ultimate value of a deep dive. And it leads me to one final, highly provocative thought for you to consider as we wrap up. Something that wasn't explicitly stated in the sources, but directly builds on everything we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
If the 2022 Marshmallow test data unequivocally proves that our willpower, our patience, and our impulse control are dictated by our localized cultural habits, and Dr. Francis's critique demonstrates that our very definition of mental health and pathology is dictated by broad systemic pharmaceutical marketing narratives.
Right.
What happens to the human mind as the internet relentlessly merges us all into a single global monoculture? Are we slowly homogenizing our brains so that we all have the exact same blind spots?
It's a profound and, frankly, alarming question.
Think about that, and next time you feel pressured to mindfully eat a marshmallow. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the comforting narratives, demand to look at the raw methodologies, and never be afraid to challenge the consensus of the settled science. because stepping out of the fantasy and into the complex, volatile reality of human data is the only way to truly understand the machine you are operating. We'll see you next time.